All right, we were now joined by Justin Williams of The Athletic. Justin wrote a column on West Virginia the other day. We'll dive into some of the rest of the Big 12. But Justin, do you feel like people, they wound up unranked in the first polls, are sleeping on West Virginia's potential a little bit?
And that's certainly what head coach Neil Brown thinks. And, I think you can make the case for why he's right. Garrett Green, I think is one of the better quarterbacks in the league. He didn't have great completion percentage last year, but he also didn't have great receivers last year. Ran the ball really well, led all Big 12 quarterbacks in rushing. And then they had two really good backs in Jaheim White and C.J. Donaldson. All three of those guys had over 700 yards each. And, had one of the best rushing attacks in the country, which has kind of become the way the Big 12 offenses play right now. And then they have some, Aubrey Burks on defense. They have some good players up front who can rush the quarterback. I thought they did really well in the portal. This is really this year and last year, the first year that they kind of had their Country Roads Trust NIL collective together. And I think you could see that in some of the retention that they had, especially, and then being able to go out and get some pieces in the portal. And, look, they won 9 games last year. They handled North Carolina in the bowl game. They were in it in the mix in the Big 12 down to the very end. And so if you're Neil Brown, I understand why you're saying, like, hey, I think people are kind of sleeping on us. And I won't be surprised if they're right in the mix again in the Big 12 this season.
Does it feel like there is momentum there? Not even so much like, hey, we saved Neil Brown's job, but like, hey, there's momentum as well. I mean, I kind of allude to that with their NIL piece, but not just for this season, but moving forward in general.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is I think there's a lot of people that are happy they didn't, jump the gun and move too quick. I think a lot of people really liked Neil Brown, and the problem was that they just weren't kind of stringing together those successful winning seasons. And then last season, he's on the hot seat. I mean, honestly, he was fired in the court of public opinion before the year even started. And they go out and win 9 games, and he gets an extension. And I think for a lot of people that believe in Neil Brown, but also that are just Mountaineers fans, you can put your program back a lot if you're constantly churning coaches, if you're paying multiple coaches at the same time because you're paying the buyouts. And so I think there was a lot of excitement that, hey, we kind of stuck with it. We saw it through. Neil Brown had some success, and then it seems like they have a lot of optimism for this year. So in my mind, it's, hey, they were in contention last year. They have every chance to be in contention this year, and they didn't jump the gun and move too early, and it worked out in their benefit.
What would trip them up from doing it?
So I think the offense is going to be fine because I think Garrett Green, I think he's going to be a little bit more efficient this year. They were explosive last year in the passing game, just not as efficient as they wanted. They went out and they added some good receivers. They got older receivers. So offensively, I think they're fine. I think the question would be defensively, specifically in the secondary. They bring back Aubrey Burks, who's like an all Big 12 caliber safety. They're going to move him around a little bit, play their spear position, which is kind of their nickel back. So then they had to bring in basically a whole new secondary beyond that. They got some good transfers at Northwestern. They went and did some good things in the transfer portal. But, Neil Brown said that it's the most talent they've had at that, secondary position, but a lot of these guys haven't played together. And, if you're going to be getting beat over the top or giving up those big chunk plays and kind of playing from behind, that to me would be the biggest question mark for them this season.
When people talk about the best quarterbacks in this league, Cam Rising comes to mind, Jalen Daniels, Avery Johnson. Garrett Green gets mentioned in there. I don't think it's ever really first, though, or maybe even second for the most part. But I think most people are aware now that there's an excitement building for him. How much excitement did you sense from Neil Brown and company about Garrett Green? And, I mean, talk about underrated or whatever, but it feels like more than the program, he might be the guy that best fits that label.
Yeah, when it kind of came up, that whole overlooked, overrated, or underrated thing, there were kind of 2 names that it felt like Neil Brown was really focusing on. One was Wyatt Milam, the left tackle, hasn't given up a sack in 2 years, and Neil Brown pointed out that he also has not made an all-conference team in those 2 years. So he was, kind of curious about that. But then, the first one he mentioned was Garrett Green, and he basically talked about if you just blind put up Garrett Green's stats from a win-loss perspective, from a production, touchdowns, yardage perspective, that he's as good as any quarterback in the Big 12. And you're right. When you kind of go through the list, he's not necessarily going to be at the top of the list that gets mentioned. And you could probably make the case because they split carries with those running backs. Everyone talks about Ollie Gordon and Taj Brooks and Devin Neal, and those guys are all great. But they also have 2 really good running backs plus Garrett Green. And so I think, his thing was, look, the preseason rankings, that doesn't really matter because they're all going to change 2 or 3 weeks into the season anyways. But he kind of felt that people were sleeping on his best players. And that was why he was so confident. People remember the year before at Media Day, they were picked dead last.
Mm-hmm.
And he went on stage and said, we're not going to finish last in the Big 12. I think it was because he knew they had some talent. They had good depth on both sides of the defensive line. And I think he feels that same way this year. They're not picked last this year, but I think they're picked 7th in preseason. And, I think Garrett Green would be the main reason that Neil Brown would point to and say, we're not going to finish 7th, this season either. And he has a chance to go out and prove it.
Justin, diving into the rest of the Big 12, this conference is going to be chaotic. I mean, ridiculously chaotic, because everybody could make the case for 8 to 10 programs that, could get in the title game, because there's no certainty on the schedule. We really don't know. Like, we think we know who's going to be really good, and we think we know who's going to be in the middle, but every year that flips. I mean, we just had the USF AD on. UCF, they're kind of a dark horse. TCU could be a dark horse. Tech is waiting to break through. Because of the schedule being so kind of scattershot, when do you think we'll really know who the teams are that are in control of the league?
Yeah, I think it's going to go right down to the end. And honestly, a big reason for that, you mentioned it, is the schedule. So there's 16 teams in this conference. They're playing 9 games. I talked to Gus Malzahn during spring, and they have 2 of the same teams on their schedule that they played last year. So yes, there was some turnover in the conference, but his point was sometimes it's going to feel like you're playing a whole new conference every season anyway, because it used to be the round robin aspect in the Big 12. It's not that way anymore. And so maybe some teams catch some breaks in terms of you miss a couple of good teams on your schedule, or maybe you have a front-loaded schedule that's really hard and you catch fire at the end of the year, or vice versa, which is why I think it's going to go to the end of the season. I think there's going to be a bunch of crazy tiebreakers that we're going to have to be figuring out. I can just see you guys on the air in late November, reading through the tiebreakers and trying to figure out where teams will slide depending on what the results are for that weekend. I think we're not going to know until you go into the last weekend, and it's going to be one of those this or this thing happens to determine who gets in the title game.
Yeah, hopefully the Big 12 has figured out their tiebreakers. I think they had a bit of an issue with that last year. Hopefully that's all settled at this point. Justin, how much excitement do you sense from folks, not directly hey, we're so glad Oklahoma and Texas are gone, but how Oklahoma ran the league for a few years, but they haven't for 2 or 3 years. Texas, finally got another Big 12 title a year ago. They were always the ones that got the most attention, and typically one or both were amongst the better teams. But how much do you think that's also kind of lit a fire of interest and just excitement for West Virginia and various others about what that looks like on the other side, with them no longer being the first off the tip of everybody's tongue?
Yeah, I think you can point to a couple things that I've heard from coaches and ADs, which is, in terms of talent and revenue, finances, there's really not a huge gap between the top of this conference now and the bottom of the conference. That wasn't the case before. Even if Texas wasn't winning the league every year, which Big 12 fans would constantly remind you of, fair enough, but they were always at the top in revenue. They always had, really talented recruiting classes. Well, now the gap between 1 and 16 is not that big. And what I think that does, is it gives everyone a chance to feel like they can win. Maybe not this year. Maybe Arizona State or Houston is not going to win the league this year. But I think if you're looking long term and you're Houston and you hired Willie Fritz, or you're Arizona State and you feel good about Kenny Dillingham, there's no reason that any team in the conference can't think, hey, sometime in the next 4 or 5 years, we have a shot to win the conference and go to the expanded playoff and kind of turn our program around. And I think you can't say that about any of the other remaining power conferences, and probably not many of the other conferences in general in FBS football. And so I'm curious to see what that looks like. I agree with you. I think there's going to be some chaos there, but I also think there's a lot of hope and optimism and excitement about the fact that this really is a wide open league this year, but also long term. I think that gives a lot of teams a chance and feels like they have a lot of investment in it.
Justin, I saw another article that you were a part of. You had the staff picking the Heisman Trophy, the 2024 Heisman Trophy fantasy draft. And so I know there was not everybody can pick everybody else, obviously, but I love the Ashton Jeanty pick. I think that's got some real value in round 4 as a guy who follows the Texas X's on the next level very closely for the Earl Campbell Award. He was one of the finalists last year. He's an incredible dual threat as a receiver and as a pass-catching running back and as a running back. I just love the Ashton Jeanty pick. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, so I was the first pick overall. We went snake style, so I was also the last pick of the draft. Mm-hmm. So he was my Mr. Irrelevant pick. Like, look, we talk about the expanded playoff. I think Boise State's one of those group of 5 teams that's going to have a chance to get that automatic group of 5, conference champion spot. And if they do it, it's probably going to be because Ashton Jeanty has a great year. Mm-hmm. And if he does and they go to the playoff, there's a chance that he's going to find his way to New York as a Heisman finalist.
Final thing for me, the ACC was in the news a bit yesterday. Not majorly, because I think everybody, for the most part, knew that nothing was going to happen yesterday. But I know you guys had a bit of an update on just everything kind of stands where it's stood and has been standing for a while now in terms of the ACC, right? That August 15th has come and gone. Depending on who you ask, there was or wasn't anything to that date. But is that where we are? The same place we kind of were even a couple of weeks ago with this whole FSU, Clemson versus the ACC battle?
Yeah, I think so. Like you kind of hinted at it. I'm not willing in this conference right now, especially with kind of the way FSU's handled things the past year or so, to make any like bold, definitive statements. But it does seem like if something was going to happen in terms of them moving conferences by next year, that something would have come out. They also, there's reporting, I think last week, that FSU was going into mediation with the ACC, unless Jim Phillips was just totally blustering when he was at ACC Media Days. There's not going to be any kind of a mediation or any kind of a deal between these two sides in terms of them letting them leave the grant of rights. So it does feel like, at least for now, whatever this dysfunctional partnership looks like, it's going to go for another season. And I do tend to think, maybe I'm wrong, if I'm just kind of guessing, it feels like they're going to stay together at least for a little bit longer, just because I don't think there's going to be an easy path for them to get the money to get out. And then I don't know that there's an obvious immediate landing spot for any of those places. Now, I do think if FSU and Clemson were, free agents all of a sudden, then maybe the Big Ten or the SEC might change their tune a little bit once that becomes reality. But it just feels like right now, without them knowing the future and not having the financials in place to get out of it, and no one else kind of wanting to step in it and, open themselves up to liability in terms of where their next landing place might be, it feels like we're just going to kind of hold steady here, at least for the next season, if not longer.
Justin, did you put in a vote for the Big 12, the order of finish, the standings this year?
Yeah, the preseason media poll.
Preseason media poll. Who did you have number 1?
I had Kansas State number 1. So I think Utah ended up being the mm-hmm. vote right by just one pick. I had Utah second. I had Kansas State first. But we talked about with West Virginia. I think I had West Virginia 7th or 8th, and I talked to Neil Brown about this when I sat down for that piece. And that I truly mean this. That's not a slight to West Virginia. I think West Virginia could easily win it, but I think you could go through that top 7 or 8 teams, and any one of them can win it. But I had Kansas State as my number 1 pick.
Yeah, and there's and I know how that feeling is like you're putting them at 8th, and it's like it's a 16-team league, man. Somebody's got to finish 8th. Somebody's got to. There might be like 7 teams that have the same amount of wins. It's just that's where we live now with these giant conferences. It's not so much a disrespect thing. Yeah.
The Vegas win totals, I think like 10 of them were between 5.5 or 6.5 or something like mm-hmm. that. Again, it's going to change probably as the season goes out, whether it's injuries or how the schedule breaks. But I think for anyone to look at it right now and really have a ton of confidence in kind of what the top 6 or 7 of that conference might be, I think that would be a pretty tough deal to handle.
Justin, quarterback depth-wise, I would rank the conferences as SEC, Big 12, Big 10, ACC. Am I wrong there?
No, I don't think so. I think with the Big 12 specifically, there's a lot of potential, but there's also some unknowns. So even if you're talking about a guy like, let's take the top 2 teams, Avery Johnson at Kansas State. Everyone you talk to around the program, around college football, is really high on Avery Johnson. But really a guy who only had one true start in the bowl game last year after Will Howard entered the transfer portal. So just some unknowns there. Utah, Cam Rising, we know what Cam Rising looks like when he's healthy, but he hasn't been healthy in a long time. And so I think you can go down the line and kind of pick out a few other guys, from schools that are like that, where it's just like, they haven't totally proven it. You know, it feels like Noah Fafita's maybe one of the more established ones. Jalen Daniels, we know what he can do when he's healthy, similar to Cam Rising, but he hasn't been healthy, you know, for a full season for a long time. And then you bring in some of those transfer guys. Like, I think DeQuan Finn could be really good at Baylor, but we just don't totally know what it looks like when he makes that move to a power conference. So I think the ceiling is very high for those Big 12 quarterbacks, but I still think there's just a lot of question marks for most of the teams.
Justin Williams of The Athletic. Justin, thanks for hopping on every single time you do. Read his work at theathletic.com. Justin, thanks so much.
Yeah, always a pleasure coming on. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah.